a year ago, James, you and I were talking about the sort of much anticipated spring offensive, which of course was delayed till the summer. Ukraine really didn't make much progress then. This year, because of the delay in getting weapons and arms into Ukraine, you remember that 60 billion that was held up in the US Congress, and it's just been unlocked, but it takes a while to get the weapons in. And Russia undoubtedly is capitalizing on that window of opportunity to try to drive forward, take advantage of Ukrainian weakness and make progress. And all the way along the front line, Russia is on the front foot. It's not making the progress that it would have wanted. And that will probably be immensely frustrating for President Putin, because he knows that once the full weight of Western weapons arrive, Russia will be subject to a pretty intensive attack. And it's also worth noting that, do you remember the battle for Bakhmut, which was particularly bloody last year? 30,000 lives lost. Now, at the peak of that, it was described as the most bloody war since World War II, or most bloody battle since World War II. There were about 800 to 900 casualties a day in there. By all accounts, reports coming out from the current front lines that Russia are encountering over 1,000 casualties a day. It's worse than Bakhmut, and they're still not making significant progress. The reason I mention all of that is that Russia is trying everything it can to push forward during this remaining window of opportunity when it's got Ukraine on the back foot, targeting Ukrainian energy infrastructure, targeting their industry, targeting the airfields, targeting the Ukrainian front line, are all part of what Russia is trying to do. And of course, whilst the weather's nice, satellites work, you can see down, you can target, and therefore you'd expect to see an intensification of Russian attacks. And I think that's what we're seeing.
And I suppose what it illustrates once again, and I'm sure this will come up at the NATO summit, and we'll come on to talk about that in detail in a moment, is the desperate need for new air defences in Ukraine.
Well, that was definitely the priority when President Zelensky appealed to President Joe Biden, that said once that number was unlocked, logistics takes a while to get this stuff forward. Now, there's no doubt the US would have lent into this slightly. They'd have forward deployed some weapons waiting for the signatory, and off you go. But President Zelensky's been very clear that Patriot has been top of his wish list. But of course, the problem with Patriot is it may be a fantastic weapon, but it's $2 or $3 million a pop. You can't use it to target everything. And therefore, it's layered air defences. That's what Ukraine's been desperately needing. Plus, of course, the ability to strike Russia in the rear areas, which has been the very topical news. But air defence is definitely a priority. And that's why Russia's been pounding across the country. And although Ukraine does appear to have shot down quite a lot of the missiles coming in, inevitably some get through.
And just on the Patriot missile systems, I mean, there is a lengthy queue of countries around the world who would like Patriot missile systems. And yes, okay, Ukraine probably needs them more than anyone else. But, people are looking after their own air defense supplies. People are anxious about making sure that they've got enough air defenses. If you're in Eastern Europe, you think, well, hang on a minute, we need them too. You've got countries all over the world who are trying to get their hands on the same air defense systems.
Yeah, there's a couple of points there. One of which, if you were the manufacturers of the Patriot system, you'd be rubbing your hands in glee. There is a phenomenal export opportunity for the US companies involved, and they've ramped up production no end. The trick, of course, is that, and we'll probably discuss this later as well, is that you don't want to let your most modern technology go into the hands of the Ukrainians, because inevitably some of these weapons do fall into the hands of the Russians. You don't want to give all your secrets away. And therefore, technology has largely been the West's asymmetric advantage in these wars. That's why we're supporting Ukraine, but we have to support them with slightly older equipment, and therefore trying to make sure the right standard of Patriot missile system finds its way into the hands of the Ukrainians is really important. But the point is this, that a lot of European countries are making sacrifices, putting equipment forward, almost certainly on the basis that America said, you put your equipment forward to Ukraine, we'll backfill it with slightly more modern systems. And that's probably the way to actually keep the supplies increasing, but providing Ukraine with the weapons of the quality that NATO and the US particularly is happy for them to have.
On the topic of equipment falling into enemy hands, Russia claims to have captured a British Storm Shadow missile. If that is true, how significant is that, Sean?
Well, first of all, I don't think they've captured a missile. What I think they've done is they found the wreckage of a missile. Capturing a missile would be a pretty, a couple of tons worth of, and you'd be taking a screwdriver and undoing it. I don't think that's the case. I think what they've done is they found the remains of a Storm Shadow missile. Now, the why that's important is because you can start to reverse engineer to work out what it can do, what its capabilities are. And once you know that, you can work out how to counter it. So, yes, it is quite alarming. And there's a couple of big buts here, one of which is most modern technology, it's not about the hardware. I'm looking at you through a computer. The hardware itself is relatively simple. The software is where the real capability lies. And of course, you can't get hold of the software once the thing has been smashed, destroyed. It's automatically expunged. So that's something they won't be able to get their hands on. Secondly, the Storm Shadows we gave to Ukraine are about 30 years old. We had, I won't get the numbers exactly right, but we bought about 1 million of these about 30 years ago, about $2 billion, so about 2 million a pop. We've used about just over 100 of them. We're going to upgrade some. We are upgrading, some of them at the moment, but we don't need 900. We're only going to upgrade a few hundred. That left a few that were available, old. We either paid industry to decommission them, or we paid industry to destroy them, or to store them, or we gave them to Ukraine to use. And actually, given their 30-year-old technology, it might not sound long, but James, you barely look 30. And if I was to look back at my mobile phone technology, 30 years ago, these really didn't exist. They were massive bricks. So you just imagine the level of technology that's actually in that missile. It's not a worry for us that we lose that sort of technology, because if that's a value to the Russians, then really are in a bad way.
On the topic of technology, the Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin has called for Russia to increase domestic production of drones fivefold by 2030. I suppose that raises the question of how central is drone warfare going to be, not just to the future of this conflict, but to the future of war more generally?
I think that's one of the big questions of our time, James. I mean, I remember thinking back to the Gulf War. We started to see these Reapers and the like, long range unmanned vehicles that, frankly, could keep an eye on a bad guy for 24 hours. My bladder wouldn't last that long, so sat in the cockpit of my jet. I'm very glad we had an unmanned aircraft to do that. And we really dismissed anything smaller as being toys. I think what we've seen in this war, a huge explosion in the utility of these things, because largely, we get seduced by them carrying weapons and suicide drones, but actually the advent of technology has meant things like cameras, things like infrared cameras, synthetic aperture radars, sensors have become much smaller, much lighter, and therefore can be carried on these drones. And we're seeing them be used in a whole variety of different ways. Also, as we've said, I think we've said before, you see these swarms of drones. They provide some fantastic, beautiful imagery. I think at Disney, they're showing a big display of these light. But imagine each of those had a hand grenade on them, and they were synchronized to fly through a window and go through every room of a building. It's horrendous. And I do think there's a whole new world out there. Now, the one caveat I would say about Russia's claim is that it's one thing to build lots of drones. It's like building aircraft. The drone is only one part of it. The real part of it is the technology you mount on the drone. Yes, you've got to make the drone light, powered and stuff like that. But then it's these sensors and it's technology that Russia has never been particularly far forward with. And I think, yes, they'll be able to put high explosive on these little drones, fly them in suicide. That's a big worry. But in terms of generating the technological advances to make these drones really, really important in this next generation of warfare, I think Russia might struggle.
Everybody's sort of too little, too late. Those children would still be alive today if we hadn't put those restrictions on. And if you can remember, at the very beginning of the war, we said no tanks for Ukraine. No, that would be provocative. That might provoke Putin to do something more. And of course, Putin is provoked by weakness, not by strength. He's a mafia thug. And so when he sees us putting these restrictions on, he does more terrible things. The time that he doesn't do terrible things is when he sees that there's going to be a real material consequence to him of doing terrible things.
On the front line, it's estimated that Russia's suffering casualties of more than 1,000 soldiers a day, but is not making significant progress on the battlefield. How long do you think Russia and the Kremlin will allow Putin to continue to prosecute a war that's no closer to achieving its aims?
Well, the problem we have is that Russia is not a democracy. Public opinion doesn't matter. The losses that Russia suffers doesn't affect Putin in any kind of psychological way at all. And just put those numbers in perspective for a second. During the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which lasted 10 years, Russia, or the Soviet Union, lost 15,000 soldiers. The numbers, as you mentioned, are 1,000 a day right now. So in 15 days, they've suffered the same casualties as the entire invasion of Afghanistan. And the numbers, according to Ukrainian sources, are well north of 500,000 casualties, 500,000 dead Russian soldiers. But to answer your question about how long could it last, the answer is a long time, because Putin doesn't care. And remember, during the Second World War, Stalin sent 25 million Russians to their death. And so Putin has a great capacity for pain. And what Putin is hoping for, and he's probably not wrong in his own assessment of probabilities, he's hoping that Donald Trump will become the next president of the United States, that America will cut off funding for Ukraine, that from lack of resources, Ukraine's defenses will crumble, and that he'll finally succeed, even with all the casualties he's had to suffer. And if he does that, then from his perspective, it's been a great venture going into Ukraine. And from our perspective, it will be an absolute disaster, not just for Ukraine, but then Putin will be lining up and targeting the Lithuania or Estonia or Latvia or even Poland. And those countries are members of NATO. And then we have this terrible situation of, let's say Donald Trump is president, will he honor the Article 5 of NATO? And I think based on his statements about NATO so far, he might very well not. If there's no more Article 5, then the question is, will Europe honor Article 5 without the Americans' help? And if not, then one of two things happen. Either we're directly at war with Russia without the Americans, or we're not, and Vladimir Putin runs roughshod all over former Soviet countries.
I mean, the NATO summit has just been taking place, 75th anniversary. Do you take any comfort in the kind of things that have come out of that?
Well, the NATO summit is a summit of democracies that are all in agreement. But the problem with these democracies that are all in agreement is that the leadership of these countries change. We saw what almost happened in France. Marine Le Pen, her party almost became in government, and it was only through a last minute horse trading that was prevented. She has publicly stated that she doesn't want to support Ukraine, and France is an important member of NATO. We mentioned Donald Trump. Of course, you've got Viktor Orban, who's a member of NATO and a member of the European Union that doesn't want to help Ukraine. And so the problem with democracies is that whatever is said today is great, but it may not be the same people saying it tomorrow, and they may be people with diametrically opposed views, which is what's so terrifying about the situation. Because we know that as long as Putin is alive, and he's going to make every effort to stay in power, and he's not going to change. So his view is the same, but there's any probability that one or many members of NATO may change in the future, and that's Putin's big bet: is that he can suffer losses, 100 times greater losses than we can, before we may very well fold with 1/100th of the pain that he's suffering, just because we're democracies.
Since we're talking about, you mentioned sort of membership of big global or contradictory memberships of big global organizations. Russia has taken over the presidency of the United Nations Security Council this month in July. It was set up to ensure global peace. And ironically, what does it do? It bombs a children's hospital in Kyiv. Russia's place is secure there because it's written into the UN Charter that permanent members are secure and have to agree a change in the Charter in order to be taken out in some way. Is the UN still fit for purpose?
The UN has completely compromised itself long before this Russia being head of the UN Security Council. You've got Saudi Arabia that's in charge of women's rights. You've got Venezuela and other countries on the Human Rights Committee. It's a complete farce at this point. It just doesn't work. It completely, in a certain way, the legitimacy of the United Nations covers up the atrocities so often of so many bad members that there really needs to be a new architecture for peace and security, and the United Nations is not it.
There is an interesting report by Bloomberg claiming Saudi Arabia made a veiled threat over pursuing any proposals to seize that almost $300 billion worth of frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine, saying they'd sell some European debt holdings and that this may have influenced the G7 to make a more conservative, still significant though, plan to use only the profits on those assets by way of a loan to help Ukraine. This has been denied by the Saudi Finance Ministry. Do you know anything about this?
Well, I've read the same article, and if it's true, it's total bluster. There's really Saudi Arabia doesn't have a lot of choices in terms of the types of assets it holds and currency it holds for its enormous profits from its oil sales. There's two basic currencies you can hold if you're that wealthy: dollars or euros. And so if Saudi Arabia wants to get out of the euro, that's absurd. It just doesn't work. And if what else are they going to do? They'll buy more dollars? Okay, fine, buy more dollars. I know plenty of financiers that would be happy to buy their French government bonds or whatever government bonds that they happen to be selling. It's an empty threat. It's a nonsense. And anybody who's scared of that doesn't understand how the international financial markets work. And I'm sure the Saudis understand that too. And I hope it's just the wrong rumor, because it would be a very stupid thing for them to be playing around with.
So do you think that kind of bluster has any effect, or is it just something for journalists, really?
Well, I know that there's a lot of people inside the bowels of the European Commission and the U.S. Treasury and various places like that are all sort of scared of their own shadow. They're scared of the sky falling. But at the same time as they're sort of saying, and they don't want to do anything. They want to just action is riskier than inaction. You lose your job if something goes wrong. You don't lose your job if you do nothing. And I think that mentality, which you see the world over in all sorts of different situations, but that mentality is very unhelpful in this particular situation, because Ukraine is suffering huge losses, as we've seen with our own eyes on TV, watching those children crushed in that hospital in Kiev. And they need resources. They need resources for weaponry, and they need resources to rebuild the hospital and their electricity infrastructure and so on that Russia has destroyed. And we have custody of those resources. We have $300 billion of Russian central bank's reserves frozen in our custody that we can give to the Ukrainians. And for all of these Chicken Little people that are saying the sky is about to fall if we were to hand that money over to Ukraine, it's just morally wrong. It's factually wrong. It's politically wrong, and it's financially wrong. We should hand that money over. There will be no consequence other than sending a very strong message to a lot of bad actors in the world that if you invade foreign countries and you have foreign exchange reserves, we're going to confiscate them. And I don't think that's a bad message. I think it's a good message.
And this is something that you have wanted and campaigned for a while now. Are you getting any traction?
Well, originally everyone said it's a non-starter, that we can't take any of that money. And then as time has gone on, and as the war has carried on, and as the economic cost has increased, we're now in a situation where it's been agreed that the West can confiscate the interest on that money, which I think is a half measure for sure. But any money is better than no money. And eventually we're going to come to the conclusion, and I guarantee you, we're going to come to the conclusion that we need to confiscate all the money, because this war is not ending anytime soon, and Ukraine needs the money. And it's better for Russia to pay for it than for us. And of course, we're all going to have to pay for it, but let's grab some of that. Why should the taxpayers of Britain and the United States and France pay for Ukraine's defense when Putin can pay for it before we do?
You mentioned Alexei Navalny, the opposition politician, earlier. An arrest warrant has just been issued for Yulia Navalny, his exiled widow. She's accused of being part of an extremist community, and the stakes are so high for anyone who dares to criticize the Kremlin. Why has she been singled out now, do you think?
Well, first of all, it's the most sadistic thing that they could ever do. They kill her husband in front of the whole world. She's calling for justice, and now they issue an arrest warrant for her. That's just sadism, pure and simple. But most importantly, whenever they do that, and I've been subject to arrest warrants for a long time, and usually whenever they start like turning up the heat is because I've hit their Achilles heel somewhere, and she has too. The fact is that she has stepped into her husband's shoes. And she is now leading the opposition. Putin is scared of any type of opposition, and she's got a very powerful case. She is an aggrieved widow who wants justice, and I think a lot of people would respond very emotionally to that call, and a lot of people in Russia, and that's very scary for Putin. And so, of course, they're going to do this. This is a sign that her presence in her campaign means something, and it's also, thankfully, she's in the West where she can be kept safe, and so no one's going to arrest Yulia Navalny. But it does show that her presence in her campaign is threatening to Putin.
You've made it your life's work to pursue corruption and to corrupt people linked to the Kremlin. Just to go back to that mention of the frozen Russian assets, $300 billion worth almost. If you're successful in that campaign, do you think that will stop Putin? What effect do you think that will have on him?
I think it would be a game changer. War is all about resources. Russia has resources from the sale of oil. Ukraine doesn't. So every time Ukraine needs resources, they've got to go hat in hand begging to the West. And we give Ukraine some resources, but not enough. And I've heard it stated explicitly by officials in the U.S. government that the United States wants to give Ukraine enough so they don't lose, but not so much so they win. And the only way to stop this is to give them everything they need to win. And if Ukraine had that money, they could buy the weapons that they need to win. And it's not a certainty that they would win from that, but I can tell you something, that the moment Putin started hearing about the idea of confiscating that money, he starts, throwing out the nuclear card. He's ready to threaten nuclear war over that. If he's so upset by that, it shows that that's something that would really change the dynamics of the situation. And so we should absolutely do it without any question.
A couple of times while we've been talking, you kind of alluded to the time it takes for things to progress in the direction which you would like them to do so. When will you consider yourself to have done your job?
Well, unfortunately, my job becomes a bigger job and a bigger job and a bigger job. I started out with the mission of fighting for justice for Sergei Magnitsky, and then Boris Nemtsov was killed. And now we need justice for Boris Nemtsov. And then Vladimir Kara-Murza is arrested. And then Alexei Navalny is killed. And then other terrible things happen. And of course, none of this is to mention the unbelievable heartache and pain and death that the Ukrainians are suffering. And so it kind of feels like it's never going to be done because there's just so much work to do. And you kind of once you start to sort of fight evil metastasizes, and there's just a never-ending stream of problems to address. And that sounds very pessimistic, and unfortunately it is. The world is a very unfair and terrible place, but it's also, from my perspective, I used to be a hedge fund manager, and I would say it's infinitely more satisfying fighting for justice for victims than it is fighting for money. And so I don't in any way dread the job I'm doing. I rise up every day and with full energy to do my job.
We're in a place right now where we're going to have to really give defense more than they're due. and I know politically that's going to be unpopular in UK. I know it. I know, and it's going to be unpopular in a lot of allied countries, including the United States. But we're in a place now where we need to do that.
You mentioned your expertise on the capabilities of NATO member states at the moment militarily.
Right.
What do we have? It's 32 member states, I believe, at the moment. How many of those do you think are in the state that they should be, capability-wise?
Poland is probably the closest.
So 1 out of 32.
Yeah. And the U.S., you could say that, but we've also got to worry about the Pacific. And if you put that into the equation, then we're stretched thin.
And it's just, when you say Poland, because of the amount of GDP they're spending on defense, is that the only criteria you believe, or is there other factors to take into account?
There's other factors. It's more than how much money you spend. It's what do you spend it on? And I always say, and your willingness to use it. You can buy an airplane, but if you don't volunteer for any NATO missions, then what good is your purchasing the airplane? So, but I think what I would say is that nations are spending more money. As you point out, the polls are like at 4%, but they're buying a lot of South Korean equipment because it can be delivered quickly. They've got that sense of urgency to them. So do the Balts. But the Balts are tiny, but the thing is, the Poles are just driving their defense procurement. They're driving their military, and that kind of drive you're starting to see in some allied countries. France, you're seeing it. I'm hoping to see that in the UK. There's somewhat of it in the US, but we're, as I said, complicated by the China paradigm. So really, it is what they spend their money on, and then another thing too. It's more than just equipment. You can have great defense spending. You can buy a lot of equipment, but if you don't have the troops to use the equipment, or the troops aren't trained correctly, or they're not deployable. They're like the Turks in some ways. They're a huge military, but they never leave Turkey except to go into northern Syria. But the problem is that with the Germans too, we don't have a lot of the core problems that are plaguing us in terms of logistics, combat service support. These are some terms of art in the military that aren't well known. But the backbone to a military force is not just the equipment that they use. It is the logistics. It is the intelligence, it's the medical services, it's a lot of things called combat service support that you've got to have to make an army effective. And that is always where you cut first. And so now we find ourselves buying new aircraft or buying other things, but that core, that backbone, I don't think it's being given the attention that it needs. If you don't have transport aircraft, if you don't have refuelers, if you don't have these enablers to help you get to the fight, then what good are you? And that's always been a problem at NATO. So again, it's not just the 2%. It's not just what you buy in terms of end items, but it's also this combat service support that you don't hear a lot about because it's only the nerds like myself who talk about it. But that's the backbone that you need. And an example of that is when the United States goes somewhere, like if we deploy to Haiti in a crisis or something like that, you see us go in, we take over an airfield, we quickly bring it up to standards. You can put in a lot of throughput, for aircraft, and they're bringing in logistics. And you've seen us do that. That's combat service support. That's logistics. That is the backbone at work. And if nations can't do that, they can't get to the fight.
You've mentioned as well the importance of demonstrating that you are prepared to use your deterrence if needed. How significant is Operation Steadfast Defender in demonstrating that from a NATO perspective, even if militarily the army and the RAF and the air forces of NATO members are not what they should be? Does things like Operation Steadfast Defender go a long way to demonstrate that actually we are ready and willing to use the deterrent?
That's exactly right. Steadfast Defender was the exercise and the type of exercise all of us were hoping we would see NATO do. We used to do those, they were called Reforger back in the 1980s, in the 70s, during the Cold War days. And Reforger was a huge exercise that brought over uh, something like 12 divisions from the United States across the Atlantic in like 12 days, or 14 divisions in 14 days, something like that. It was a huge movement of U.S. forces into Europe and then marrying up with pre-positioned equipment and with European allies and then moving to the front lines on the inter-German border. It was a huge exercise. We had to do it to make sure we could do it quickly, but it was a symbol to the Soviets at the time that we were ready, able, and capable of doing this. And it was a signal to them each time that helped us with deterrence. If we couldn't do it, if we'd never practiced it, and so the Russians or the Soviets were led to think that, well, maybe the U.S. can't even get here. That weakens your deterrence. But if your deterrence is based on showing your opponent that you've got what it takes to get to where you need to go to fight them, and you're willing to do it, that's the cornerstone of deterrence. That's what Reforger, which stood for Return of Forces to Europe, Reforger. So this other exercise is along those lines, and so it was. And I guarantee you, the next time that they do it, it'll be even bigger, because it's doing the kinds of exercises that we need to do now, because we've lost the muscle memory of large-scale reinforcements in the U.S. military, in the U.S. Navy. I mean, you don't practice this all the time, and certainly not after the end of the Cold War. So I predict we'll see more of steadfast jazz type of exercises where we get that muscle memory back, and we show Putin that we're really serious.
I want to ask you a couple of questions about the mood in Washington. You're in Washington at the moment. You're at the NATO forum. What are the kind of conversations that you're having with people? Is it all about the possibility of a second Trump presidency? Is it about what Russia's doing in Ukraine? What are the conversations that seeming on the edges of what the media might see that are going on behind the scenes amongst people like yourself who really know the issues that are behind the headlines?
Well, I think a lot of us shake our heads and we just look at each other and go, "Can you believe this?" Whether it's the state of our presidential elections, Trump versus Biden, and the choices that we have to make here, whether it is that we are returning NATO to this wartime footing that we thought we wouldn't see again, wrongly, but we thought that those days were over, and here we are, right back smack dab in the middle of that. And talking about what the next steps are, Ukraine membership, the kinds of things that you would think we'd be talking about, certainly are being talked about, but under this cloud of U.S. politics. And what does this mean if Trump comes in? And that's what's being talked about over the coffee and in the hallways here is just what you would expect it to be. And the weather, of course, the weather here is broiling us, and so, yeah.
Absolutely. Has the word conscription come up at all in your conversations with anyone?
As a matter of fact, the conversation about conscription does come up. In fact, it came up a couple of days ago. We did a media call here at CNAS, and we talked about conscription. And I think that is more and more on people's minds in terms of trying to make sure we have the sailors for the Royal Navy and the pilots for the RAF and for the U.S. Air Force and stuff. I think, are we going to have to do that in the modern military force where so much depends on people who know IT and AI and things that we weren't worried about in the Cold War days, but are really specialists and trying to find those that would come into the military who could get much higher paying jobs in Silicon Valley. Can we get them into the military and the high tech side? Yeah. So I think conscription is being whispered now. Is that a way we can deal with recruitment problems that we all have? All of us have this, including here in the U.S. And it's something that we're comparing notes on. Well, how would you do it? How does the U.S. do it now? On Capitol Hill, it's being discussed a little bit. Do we do selective service now compulsory for men and women who turn 18? And so it's being talked about, and talk about a powerful signal. Should we begin to do that? that will be a signal to Putin that we are in fact gearing up, and a signal to our own people. Because here in the U.S., if you talk to someone out on the street, if they overheard what we were saying, they wouldn't believe their ears, that we were dealing with such a tension-filled situation on Europe. But if suddenly coming out of Capitol Hill, there is some new laws dealing with the draft, as we call it, that would be quite a wake-up call. And it could be politically sensitive too. So it's something you have to, at this stage, only whisper about.
It was his first big gain when he annexed a Crimea. And sort of, Crimea is his sort of Mary Tudor's Calais, written on my heart, it seems. And it's one cannot see Putin, and it's not appeared in any of his rather strange offers for peace negotiations. One cannot see him ever conceding the possibility of giving up Crimea. If he does, by the way, it means he's also lost the Black Sea. So it's a really difficult one, and it's where I think the Ukrainian forces can balance their very obvious weakness, which is in manpower. Above all, they're finding it very difficult to conscript. It's going badly. A lot of people are dodging. The forces on the front line are exhausted. But my friend Luke Harding of The Guardian, who's just come back from the front in the Kharkiv sector, and he said, as happens often in these things, morale gets higher as you get closer to the fight. Curiously, they know it's very difficult. They know that they're outgunned by the Russians at the moment, but they're still doing ingenuity. That is the point about doing the ingenuity piece, is that the Ukrainians seem to be tactically so much more innovative than the Russians, although the Russians have adapted in very big and important areas, particularly electronic warfare. Trump, against his better instincts, if he does become president again in November, will have to be more collective. Will have to be more. He will need allies, because he needs allies above all for the Pacific, for the target date of 2027 and China, and possibly the date to really make a military effort on Taiwan. And America can't do that alone. It really needs friends right across the world.
Robert, let's talk about Russia's new security deal with North Korea, because I know you've written about it. It included a deal to send engineering and construction troops to Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine. What does this tell us in turn about Russia's manpower problem?
It's terrible, and there are terrible reports coming out from the occupied areas of the Donbass just in the last few days since the North Korea visit, where they're getting civilians, where they're threatening them with taking all rights, access to medical facilities away. You've got to have a Russian passport. You've got to have, it seems in cases that they're transporting them, particularly children, of course, as we know, back into Russia. It's a mess by all accounts. You discount some of this too. Obviously, people like Budanov, who we've mentioned, the intelligence chief, effectively the number two in Kiev's forces in the order of battle of Ukraine. They're making the most of it, but the reports from inside are really pretty dreadful. They're having a dreadful time in the occupied Donbass. Hence your point about military personnel, and I think other personnel. I think that what Putin was wanting, I think probably tens of thousands of North Korean laborers to go in and help out, because it isn't just the security on the Ukrainian front, where he boasted, involved in the Ukrainian campaign, there are now 750,000, but they need a lot for the security in the enormous, etoliated, stretched out security problem that they've got going right across deep Russia, particularly as they face the borders with China. It's not that they're facing confrontation, but they are facing civil unrest and disorder in a lot of these places in the deep steppe. And I think that's what they're saying. They need lifters, they need logisticians, they need low-level security guards. And I think that it was so clear that they trumpeted the big deal with Pyongyang when he went to visit Kim Jong-un. That was all known about. We knew they were getting weapons. They knew they were talking about mutual defense agreements, and they were very clear to say this is only for defensive and not offensive purposes. And then you got these whispers, you got these unofficial accounts. Oh, they're talking about labor. They're talking about getting people in, which I think didn't please the Chinese too much, too.
You described that security agreement as a dance of the desperate. But for those who do get alarmed when Russia does its nuclear saber rattling, how advanced do you think North Korea's program is? Because the fear is that in needing help from North Korea, how far will President Putin go in helping North Korea's nuclear program?
Quite a lot, I think. And I think that's what Kim wanted. Because they have made advances, but have you looked at the latest firings of missiles? They've not been going too well from North Korea. There is something something megalomaniac about Kim's posturing. And they do want these global missiles. They want technology from China. And I think China, by the way, has been very careful about it, but very, very long-range missiles. Now, if they get into bed with Russia on that, I think that is extremely worrying. We've heard a lot in the propaganda about the hypersonics, the Kinsal missile, for instance. It hasn't been that effective in Ukraine. That's the kind of thing that they'll be working on together, because it is a main effort by the North Korean arms industry. I just don't think, as I said, I just want to add as a footnote, and it's not a little footnote, I don't think China can be too keen on all this sort of the dance of the desperate between those two, because China has a very clear strategy, and it's much more focused in some ways even than Putin, because Putin drifts off into fantasy with his strategic thinking and planning. And sometimes China really does know what it wants, and it doesn't want that strategic view of the world, that strategic plan, upset by loonies, frankly.